Brooklyn, the Upper East Side, the Upper West Side, Harlem. They were the residents of choice of developers in the mid-19th century. Let's take a look at one at 29 West 88th Street. Quite often, these brownstones were built as developments. That means they built multiple ones at once. You can see every other one has these arched windows at the top floor, that they were all built together. Each entrance has the same sort of treatment around it, and every other bay has a bay window. All that indicates that they were all built together as one design. So this row of brownstones has 4 floors above grade, 1 on grade, and then there's usually a cellar below that. And typically the main entrance was on what we call the parlor floor, or 1 floor above the ground level. And there's a big stoop that leads up to it. Stoop is just a Dutch word for staircase. Servants usually entered down on the ground floor, and the family entered on what was called the parlor floor. And the parlor floor is elevated just to avoid all of the horse manure that filled the streets of mid-19th century New York. So between each individual unit is what's called a party wall, and it's much easier to see from an overhead view. So one of the main characteristics of a brownstone apartment, though, is that you can only get light from the front or the back because of these party walls. You can't get it from the sides unless, of course, you have an end house on the block. And as you can see, each house is set back from the rear, and it creates this whole rear yard that's over here. And here's the street. So New York City's laid out on a grid. So essentially what you have is between the avenues, you have a 200-foot block and then a 60-foot street, and then another 200-foot block and another 60 street. And so they took that 200-foot block right here, that's 200 feet, and then they took a 60-foot street. And they took that 200-foot block and they divided it in half, and they made 100-foot deep blocks. And they basically divided those blocks into 25-foot slivers. So that's the basic building block of a New York City block. And each one of these is 25 feet. And 200 plus 60 is 260, and if you multiply that by 20, you pretty much get a mile, and that's why 20 New York City blocks is considered 1 mile. So you'll notice in these overhead shots that there's no alleyways behind these rows of houses, and that's the reason why you see all the trash piled up on the front side of the street, because there was no alleyway to fit the trash in the back. So in 1811, when they laid this out, people didn't really have that much garbage. I mean, there was a privy in the backyard, and you used nearly everything. Any food that you didn't use went to the livestock, and people didn't have nearly as much as what we all have today. So it's a common sight in New York to see these mountains of garbage along the curbs every other day of the week. And it's because we don't have alleyways. Now let's look at railroad apartments and tenement buildings. So a railroad apartment is essentially just an apartment where one room leads into the next room, like in a railroad car. You go from one car to the next. Has an overhead view. You have one room leading into another room. So if this was a flat like that, there'd be one room here, another room here, and another room here. So if I'm in this room, in order to get to any other room, I've got to pass through each room if I wanted to get to the back room. Where in a typical apartment, there would be a corridor on the side, and you would circulate into each room from that corridor, like that. Okay, let's take a look at one at 39 Henry Street. Okay, this is a building that was built in the late 1800s on Henry Street on the Lower East Side. My grandmother was born in this building in 1899, and the building is still there. At that time, the street would have been filled with push carts and horses and throngs of people. Now it's just cars parked. So tenement houses were built for the lower classes, mainly for immigrant groups. So imagine in these earliest apartments having a family living in each one of these rooms. It would be very crowded, and there'd be absolutely no privacy. At a grander level, that's called enfilade, and you could see that in famous museums where you go from one gallery to the next gallery without going out into a corridor. But here, at a much smaller scale, it's how the apartments were set up, and usually there were just like 3 rooms. There was a bedroom, a kitchen, and maybe there was another room between them. Quite often it was just 2 rooms. So originally when these were built, a lot of these rooms didn't have any light and air. So light and air means natural light and operable windows to let fresh air into the rooms. A lot of these apartments had rooms with no windows at all, and were inhabited by multiple families. And so obviously they were breeding grounds for disease. But at the time there were no laws about that. It wasn't until about 1901 that New York City passed a law that said you must include air in these rooms. And so they created what's called these air shafts. And if we look at an overhead shot, you can see right here that these air shafts were then included, and they're very narrow. So the air shafts added light and air to a lot of these apartments, but at the same time, they also created other problems because trash would pile up in them and stagnant water would be there, and it would create a whole other source for disease. But by inserting these air shafts, you created what's called a dumbbell plan because the shape that was left was sort of shaped like a dumbbell. So early on, an entire family of 6 or 8 people would live just in one room. And there was a famous book by Jacob Riis called How the Other Half Lives. So people's eyes were open to the sort of squalor that people were living in, and that was what prompted change. And when these apartments were built, there was no plumbing, so there were still outhouses in the backyard. And when that law was passed for the air shaft, they also insisted that you had to have a toilet in each building, and no more than 20 people could share that toilet, which is quite astounding today. A lot of these apartments, people wonder why were there bathtubs in the kitchen, and there were bathtubs in the